pulling data from individual counties, not only of who was registered, but who had voted, and then tracking that information for campaigns. A good amount of our information is made public, not only these large data sets that we've put out for the 14 general, but also at any time you can go onto our website and look at any city, school board, water district, all the way down to mosquito abatement districts to see likely voter universes, who's voted in past elections with breakdowns for ethnicity and age, income, and other valuable information. What I'm going to focus on is turnout using both the active current voter file and then also using archives that we maintain going back to 2002, some of which have been provided to groups like UC Berkeley, some of the foundations, PPIC, and others. The first thing to note about California elections, and speaking specifically to our state's elections, is that not all elections are equal. If you look at the first table in the presentation, it shows a clustering that elected officials are very aware of, that there's a clustering of high turnout in presidential elections, moderate turnout in gubernatorial general elections, lower turnout in presidential primaries, and even lower turnout in gubernatorial primaries. And then beyond that, like was discussed earlier, much lower turnout in some localities in both special elections and municipal standalone elections. Now, one thing to really put a point on it, when we got done with the 2012 general, I looked back at voters who were young voters who had voted for the first time in 2008. And they had also voted in the 2012 general. And looking at just those voters, only 27% of them had voted in any intervening election. That means that of those voters who turned 18, 19, 20, 21, 22 in the big exciting Obama election in 2008, registered, voted, got engaged, got their sticker, talked to their friends about it, they then went home and they sat on the sidelines for 4 years, not voting again until another presidential election. And for me, it is as if the voters' interest in politics is kind of like my interest in college basketball. You know, I think they play games year-round or something. But really, I only pay attention once it's the Final Four. And same thing, the first football game I watched all year was the Super Bowl. Maybe even the last quarter or half or a third or whatever they play in football.
You're so un-American.
I know. But it's just joking about, but it's real for people who are engaging in politics. Those of us in this room and maybe people watching online are hyper engaged. For us, this is something that it's a value for us to be engaged in what's happening in elections, and it's not necessarily something that is shared by all voters equally. So looking particularly at this election, we had all-time lows, we know that. 42% turnout statewide. In LA County, it was 31% turnout. And these tables on the large tabloid really show both the breakdown for LA versus not LA, but then also within that, the breakdown for different ethnic populations, the breakdown by partisanship. And I'm not going to talk a lot about partisanship other than to say that partisan voters are actually higher turnout voters. Households with two partisan voters are higher turnout even more. And there's some reinforcing in areas of the state where there is kind of a more hyper-partisan or active, engaged political community versus other parts of the state where there's a growing number of independents and people are maybe less tethered to the political activism of a political party. The important thing to note, though, when you talk about turnout is that this sinking tide does not bring down all ships equally. You know, the differences are really striking when you look at these different factors of age, ethnicity, and others. You know, I was looking at the data, and if you just look at age, the average voter in this election was not just older than the average Californian. The average voter was older than the average Californian's parents. It's very striking how old this electorate is. I joke that one of that the average voter in this last election, when they had to memorize in elementary school the state capitals, They had to memorize all 48 state capitals. The electorate is not reflective of California. And that's a really big and challenging thing, particularly when you get into looking at what is elected, how people are getting elected, and then who they're representing, and the differences there. If you look at this table again in the presentation, this next large table with this ages graph, we don't have it up there, but essentially what it shows is there's this great fluctuation in turnout based on age. And in fact, if you were to look at over 65-year-old voters in this last election, this gubernatorial election didn't look much different than most gubernatorial elections for people who are over 65. The turnout was maybe a point down, maybe even a point up for some of the older voters. The drop in turnout was in the middle of the electorate in terms of the age range. The turnout also, to put a point on it with regards to ethnicity, the statewide turnout in 2012 was roughly 25% Latino. That is not reflective of the state, even though that was a very high turnout election. We know Latinos are the largest ethnic group in the state. It wasn't reflective of the state at the time. It wasn't reflective of the state 10 years ago. That Latino turnout was reflective of the state in 1980, when in the census, Latinos obtained about 25% of the state's population. In this city election, with roughly 15% Latino turnout, that is not reflective of the county of LA. That is not reflective of the county of LA 10 years ago. That is reflective of the county of LA in 1970. So we have very striking differences between the who's actually voting and the overall population. And for those of us who grew up in LA, I'll name a couple neighborhoods that really put a point on this as well. Chinatown, Lakeview Terrace, Montecito Heights, Mission Hills, North Long Beach, Sun Valley, Sylmar. All of these communities have ethnic populations that are a majority of the population, and the largest ethnic population is either Latino or Asian among its registered voters. But all of those communities, the average voter was white. So it's a very different electorate. I mean, think of Sylmar as being a place where the average voter is a 60-year-old white homeowner, as opposed to if we were all just to get in a bus and go to Sylmar and step out and look at the population that those elected officials are representing. In terms of solutions, really, and this was talked about earlier, there are things that correlate with turnout very strongly. Being a permanent absentee voter seems to correlate with turnout. Having a high income, having a college degree, your age correlates with turnout. Home ownership. But until this committee comes up with a way to give everybody a home and give everybody a bachelor's degree and make everybody older, you really have to look at the levers that are available to the committee. And if you look at the final set of slides from that presentation, you can see that permanent absentee voter status has consistently been a divider in terms of those high turnout voters and the low turnout voters. And overall, no matter what the age is, that difference is roughly about 15 to 20 point difference for somebody who's a permanent absentee voter versus somebody who's a poll voter. If you're to look at this most recent LA election, it's true not only for the overall electorate, but even age groups. You can look at, homeowners, affluent, college educated, and if they're PAV, they turn out higher than their poll voting peers. If you look at low income, renter, Latinos, they turn out higher if they're a PAV than if they're a poll voter. So definitely there's a thing out there. Researchers might dispute its actual effectiveness, but that is one thing that seems to be a lever that's available to those in Sacramento. And it's available, and it seems like it would be effective, although researchers definitely have to look at other elements in addition to PAV. There are other environmental factors that were discussed that really aren't my area of expertise. such as enthusiasm, such as the type of candidates. And again, those are things that it seems like are not necessarily within the purview of the, this committee and of people in Sacramento. So I think the data that we've presented to you and that you have in front of you, I'm more than happy to answer questions about it. I'm more than happy to dive into these issues of absentee voting and also looking more deeply at age and income. And happy to take any questions or pass on to the other presenters.